Paul Lafargue. 30. Private session of the Commission on Primary Education of 1849. To make the influence of the clergy all-powerful, because I count upon it to propagate that good philosophy which teaches man that he is here below to suffer, that other philosophy which on the contrary bids man to enjoy. Stating the ethics of the capitalist class, whose egoism and narrow intelligence he incarnated. Struggling against the nobility sustained by the clergy, a flag of free thought and atheism, but triumphant, its tone and manner, and today it uses religion to support its economic and political supremacy. In 16th centuries, joyfully taken up the pagan tradition and glorified the flesh and its passions, reaped by Christianity, is with goods and with pleasures, is the teachings of its thinkers like Rabelais and Diderot, and his abstinence to the wage workers. A whole parody on Christian ethics, with its anathema the flesh of the laborer. It is to reduce the producer to the smallest number of needs, press his joys and his passions, and to condemn him to play the part of a machine turning out work without respite and without thanks. The socialists must take up again the battle fought by the philosophers and pamphleteers of the bourgeoisie. They march up to the assault of the ethics and the social theories of capitalism. They demolish in the heads of the class which they call to action the prejudices sown in them by the ruling class. They proclaim in the faces of the hypocrites of all ethical systems that the earth shall cease to be the vale of tares for the laborer. The communist future, we shall establish peaceably if we may, flee if we must. The impulses of men will be given a free rein. These impulses are by nature good, nothing to avoid but their misuse and their excesses, and not be avoided except by their mutual counterbalancing, by harmonious development of the human organism. Dr. Beddoes says, when a race reaches its maximum of physical development, that arrives at its highest point of all vigor. The opinion of the great naturalist Charles Darwin of the right to work, which I am republishing with some additional notes, appeared in the weekly Égalité 80 series. J. Prison 83. Emma possesses the working classes of the nations where capitalist civilization holds its sway. This in its train the individual and social woes which for 2 centuries have tortured sad humanity. The love of work, the fierce passion for work, even to the exhaustion of the vital force of the individual and his progeny. In this mental aberration, the mists and the moralists have cast a sacred halo over work. Men, to be wiser than their God, contemptible men, they zoomed to rehabilitate what their God had cursed. I do not profess to be a Christian, a mist or a moralist, ill from their judgment to that of their God, preachings of their religious emics or free thought ethics, take full consequences of work in capitalist society. Society work is the cause of all intellectual degeneracy, organic deformity. Bred in Rothschild's stables, by a retinue of bipeds, heavy brute of the Norman farms which plows the earth, manure the crops, lavage whom the missionaries of trade and the traders of religion have not yet corrupted with Christianity, and the dogma of work. Look at our miserable slaves of machines. Civilized Europe. Find a trace of the native beauty of man. Go seek it in the nations where economic prejudices have not yet uprooted the hatred of work. Generating. Will boast of possessing fewer factories than we have of prisons and barracks. But rejoices in his admiration of the hardy Andalusian. His native chestnuts. Inflexible as a steel rod. And leaps at hearing the beggar. Draped in his ragged capa. On terms of equality with the Duke of Ossuna. A primitive animal has not been atrophied. The worst sort of slavery. The of greatness had only contempt for work. The slaves alone were permitted to labor. The man knew only exercises for the body and mind. Era that men like Aristotle, Aphanes moved and breathed among the people. The time when a handful of heroes at Marathon crushed the hoe. To be subdued by Alexander. The antiquity taught contempt for work, predation of the free man, but sang of idleness, from the gods. O nobis haec otia facit. Airmen on the mount, idleness, the lilies of the field, grow, they'll not, do they spin. I say unto you that even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. An angry God. Worshippers the supreme example of ideal laziness. Acts days of work. For all eternity. Races for which work is an organic necessity. The Scotch. The Indians of the British Isles. The Thonians of Spain, the Iranians, the Iranians of Germany, the Thonians of Asia, in which are the classes that love work for work's sake. Theaters, shopkeepers, farmer bent double over their fields, the crouched in their shops. The mole in his subterranean passage and never stand up to look at nature leisurely. Proletariat. The class embracing all the producers of civilized nations. This which in freeing itself will free humanity from servile toil and will make of the human animal a free being. The Tariat. By its instincts. Doing its historic mission. Itself be perverted by the dogma of work. Been its punishment. All and social woes are born of its passion for work. Inventy at London. An pamphlet appeared under the title An on Trade and Commerce. In its time, a philanthropist, wasn't that the factory population of England had taken into its head the fixed idea that in their quality of Englishmen all the individuals composing it have by right of birth the privilege of being freer and more independent than the labourers of any country in Europe. Its usefulness for soldiers. It stimulates their valour. The factory workers are imbued with it the better for themselves and the state. To look on themselves as independent of their superiors. It is dangerous to encourage such infatuations in a commercial state like ours. Perhaps 7/8 of the population have little or no property. Complete until our industrial laborers are contented to work 6 days for the same sum which they now earn in 4. Century B. Was openly preached in London as a curb to the noble passions of man. The work, vices they will have. Napoleon on May 5, 1807. Strad. I. And be disposed to order that on Sunday after the hour of service be passed, shops be opened and the laborers return to their work. And curb the sentiments of pride and independence which arise from it. The essay on trade proposed to imprison the poor in ideal workhouses would become houses of terror. Would work 14 hours a day in such fashion that when meal time was deducted there should remain 12 hours of work full and complete. Work a day. The ideal of the philanthropists and moralists of the 18th century. And this nec plus ultra have become ideal houses of correction in which the toiling masses are imprisoned and are condemned to compulsory work for 12 or 14 hours. Men only but also women and children. Sons of the heroes of the terror have allowed themselves to be degraded by the religion of work, of accepting. 1848. Evolutionary conquest. The limiting factory labor to 12 hours. The revolutionary principle, the right to work. Proletariat. All have been capable of such baseness. Heroic times would have required 20 years of capitalist civilization before he could have conceived such vileness. And compulsory work and the tortures of hunger have descended upon the proletariat more in number than the locusts of the Bible, because the proletariat itself invited them. In 1848 the laborers demanded with arms in their hands, that imposed on their families, they delivered up to the barons of industry their wives and children. Would they have demolished their domestic hearths? They have dried up the milk of their wives. The carrying and nursing their babes have been obliged to go into the mines and factories to bend their backs and exhaust their nerves. They have broken the life and the vigor of their children. Proletarians. We housewives told of in our fables and in our old tales. Rank of speech. Bacchus. Some girls. On the move. Alking. Onging. Alreading life. Entering. Gainless birth to healthy and vigorous children. Factory girls and women. Paving flowers. Impoverished blood. Withered stomachs. With limbs. Then the pleasure of a healthful passion. May be capable of telling of it merrily. To work for children. Simon of the Academy of Moral and Political Science. The Germanies of Jesuitism. Invented a vice more degrading to the intelligence of the children, corrupting of their instincts, destructive of their organism than work in the vitiated atmosphere of the capitalist factory. Called the century of work. A century of pain and corruption. And philosophers. The economists from the painfully confused Auguste Comte to the ludicrously clear Leroy Beaulieu. The of bourgeois literature from the quackishly romantic Victor Hugo to the artlessly grotesque Paul de Kock. All toned nauseating songs in honor of the god Progress, son of work. Would think that happiness was soon to reign over the earth. The coming was already perceived. Dust of past centuries to bring back feudal miseries to serve as a somber contrast to the delights of the present times. Satisfied people. Today pensioners at the table of the nobility, pen valets of the capitalist class and fatly paid. Weary of the peasant, La Bruyere described him. What he brilliant picture of proletarian delights in the year of capitalist progress 1840. One of their own men, Villerm, the Institute. 1848 was a member of that scientific society. A mission disseminated among the masses the nonsense of bourgeois economics and ethics. Issuing Alsace that Dr. Villerm speaks. The Os of Kestner and Dollfuss. Flowers of industrial philanthropy and republicanism. Raises up before us his picture of proletarian miseries. Listen to an Alsatian manufacturer, Th. Meeg, of Dollfuss, Co. The condition of the old-time artisan. House 50 years ago. 1813. Modern mechanical industry was just arising. Workers were all children of the soil. In the town and the surrounding villages. Most all owning a house and often a little field. Age of the laborer. Alsatian industry did not deluge the world with its cottons. Millionaires out of its Dollfuss and Coechlin. Years after, when visited Alsace, modern Minotaur, capitalist workshop, heard the country, insatiable appetite for human labor it had dragged the workmen from their hearths, to rout the labor which they contained. It's that the workers flocked together at the signal of the steam whistle. Slurm 5,000 out of 17,000. Forced by high rents to lodge in neighboring villages. 3 or 4 miles from the factory where they worked. Knock began at 5 o'clock in the morning and ended at 8 o'clock in the evening. In winter. Watch them arrive each morning into the city and depart each evening. Multitude of women, pale, walking barefooted through the mud, for lack of umbrellas when the rain or snow fell, aprons or skirts turned up over their heads. The larger number of young children, dirty, pale, rags, from the machine oil which drops on them while they work. They did from the rain because their clothes shed water. But the women just mentioned, they not carry their day's provisions in a basket, carried in their hands or hid under their clothing as best they might. The of bread which must serve them as food until time for them to return home. Of an insufferably long day at least 15 hours is added for these wretches the fatigue of the painful daily journeys. To reach home overwhelmed by the need of sleep. Day they rise before they are completely rested in order to reach the factory by the opening time. Lulls in which were packed those who lodge in the town. At Mulhouse and Dornoch. Bring houses. Those miserable lodgings where 2 families slept each in its corner on straw thrown on the floor and kept in its place by 2 planks. Among the laborers of the cotton industry in the department of the Upper Rhine is so extreme that it produces this sad result. In the families of the manufacturers, keepers or factory superintendents, children reach their 21st year. The half ceases to exist before the lapse of 2 years in the families of weavers and cotton spinners. Of the workshop. That's not a work, a torture, and it is inflicted on children of 6 to 8 years. torture day after day which wastes away the laborers in the cotton spinning factories. And of the work Villerm observes, the convicts in prisons work but 10 hours, those in the West Indies work but 9 hours. War existed in France after its revolution of 1789, proclaimed the pompous rights of man factories where the day was 16 hours, which the laborers were allowed only an hour and a half for meals. What portion of the revolutionary principles of the bourgeoisie was from its God progress? Hail as benefactors of humanity those who, having done nothing to become rich, work to the poor, scatter pestilence and to poison the springs than to erect a capitalist factory in the midst of a rural population. Work, and well joy, and liberty, to all that makes life beautiful and worth living. And go on repeating to the laborers, increase social wealth, and less an economist. D. Tracy, or nations that people are comfortable, in nations they are ordinarily poor. Disciple Cherbulies continues, those themselves in cooperating toward the accumulation of productive capital contribute to the event which sooner or later must deprive them of a part of their wages. Stupefied by their own howlings, the mists answer, work, work, to your prosperity. Am of Christian meekness a priest of the Anglican Church. The Mr. Townsend, ins. Day. But your poverty increase and your poverty releases us from imposing work upon you by force of law. The of work gives too much trouble, rears too much violence and makes too much noise. Contrary, is only a pressure which is peaceful and incessant. As a natural motive for work and industry, so provokes to the most powerful efforts. Proletarians, increase social wealth and your individual poverty, in that becoming poorer, have more reason to work and become miserable. Cerebral law of capitalist production. Ear to the fallacious words of the economists. Proletarians have given themselves up body and soul to the vice of work. They precipitate the whole of society into these industrial crises of overproduction which convulse the social organism. Is a plethora of merchandise and a dearth of purchasers. These are closed and hunger scourges the working people with its whip of 1,000 lashes. Bruised by the dogma of work, understanding that the overwork which they have inflicted upon themselves during the time of pretended prosperity is the cause of their present misery, do run to the granaries of wheat and cry, "We hungry to eat red cent, but as we are, less, harvested the wheat and gathered the grapes." The warehouse of bonnet, jurios, enter of industrial convents, and out at your working women, workers, shivering pitifully under their patched cotton dresses, they who have spun and woven the silk robes of the fashionable women of all Christendom. Working 13 hours a day had no time to think of their toilet. That of work and have time to rustle in the silks they have made. Est their milk teeth they have devoted themselves to your fortune and have lived in abstinence. Measure and wish to enjoy a little of the fruits of their labor. Silks, and shall furnish his muslins, or courtier his calicoes, and his boots for their dear little feet, damp, toe and gleeful, delightful to look at. Bayesians, friend of humanity, are not, and into the bargain. Of your working girls the fortune they have built up for you out of their flesh. You help business, goods into circulation. Here's ready at hand. Give credit. You held to give credit to merchants whom you do not know from Adam or Eve. Given you nothing, a glass of water. You'll pay the debt the best they can. They let their notes go to protest. They have nothing to attach. Demand that they pay you in prayers. Paradise better than your black-gowned priests steeped in tobacco. In advantage of periods of crisis. General distribution of their products and a universal holiday. Others, pay with hunger, beat their heads against the doors of the workshops. With satiated bodies, speeches they assail the manufacturers. Good agate, Sam Schneider, work, is not hunger, but for work which torments us. And scarcely the strength to stand upright. 12 and 14 hours of work twice as cheap as when they had bread on the table. Of industry profit by their lockouts to manufacture at lower cost. Crises follow periods of overwork as inevitably as night follows day. After them lockouts and poverty without end. They lead to inevitable bankruptcy. Manufacturer has credit, he gives free rein to the rage for work. And goes again. Raw material to his laborers. And on producing without considering that the market is becoming satiated and that if his goods don't happen to be sold, his will still come due. Implores the banker. He throws himself at his feet. His blood. Here. I'll do my business better. The Rothschild. 1,000 pairs of hose in your warehouse. Worth 20c. 4c. The possession of the goods and sells them at 6c or 8c. At certain frisky dollars which owe nothing to anybody. Manufacturer has stepped back for a better leap. It comes and the warehouses disgorge. Merchandise a window that you cannot imagine how it came in by the door. Are required to figure the value of the goods that are destroyed. They were burned or thrown into the water. But this decision, the manufacturers travel the world over in search of markets for the goods which are heaping up. They went to annex Congo, to Tonkin, to down the Chinese wall with cannon shots to make an outlet for their cotton goods. Injuries. It was a duel to the death between France and England as to which should have the exclusive privilege of selling to America and the Indies. And vigorous men reddened the seas with their blood during the colonial wars of the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries. There's of capital as well as of goods. The longer know where to place it. The happy nations who are leafing in the sun smoking cigarettes and they lay down railroads, factories and import the curse of work. Nation of French capital ends one fine morning in diplomatic complications. Example. in Germany were on the point of hair-pulling to decide which usurers shall be paid first. It's like that in Mexico, where French soldiers are sent to play the part of constables to collect bad debts. And social miseries, how great and innumerable they may be, how eternal they appear, vanish like hyenas and jackals at the approach of the lion. Proletariat shall say, I will. By realization of its strength, the proletariat must trample underfoot the prejudices of Christian ethics, ethics and free thought ethics. Its natural instincts. It proclaim the rights of laziness, 10 times more noble and more sacred than the anemic rights of man concocted by the metaphysical lawyers of the bourgeois revolution. Itself to working but 3 hours a day, bring the rest of the day and night for leisure and feasting. That has been easy, but to describe real evils well known of us, convince the proletariat that the ethics inoculated into it is wicked, the bridled work to which it has given itself up for the last 100 years is the most terrible scourge that has ever struck humanity, that will become a mere condiment to the pleasures of idleness, official exercise to the human organism, useful to the social organism only when wisely rated to a maximum of 3 hours a day, an arduous task beyond my strength. Only physiologists, humanists and economists could undertake it. Inches I shall merely try to show that given the modern means of production and their unlimited reproductive power, it is necessary to curb the extravagant passion of the laborers for work and to oblige them to consume the goods which they produce. Of overproduction. Of Cicero's time, Eros, of the invention of the watermill, funding grain, to free the slave women and bring back the golden age, arm which turns the mill, and peacefully. Warn you in vain, that day is breaking. Dozed upon the nymphs the labor of the slaves, and them leaping merrily over the wheel, and the axle tree, with its spokes and making the heavy rolling stone revolve. Let our fathers rejoice in idleness over the gifts that the goddess grants us. The pagan poet announced, come. And murderous passion for work transforms the liberating machine into an instrument for the enslavement of free men. It impoverishes them. A makes with her needles only 5 meshes a minute. Wharton circular knitting machines make 30,000 in the same time. A machine is thus equivalent to 100 hours of the working women's labor, or of the machine's labor, working women 10 days of rest. Wing industry is more or less true for all industries reconstructed by modern machinery. But in the machine is improved and performs man's work with an ever-increasing rapidity and exactness, the of prolonging his former rest times, his ardor, a wish to rival the machine. A murderous competition of man and the machine might have free course. Proletarians have abolished wise laws which limited the labor of the artisans of the ancient guilds, suppressed the holidays. Beggars of that time worked but 5 days out of 7. I believe the stories told by lying economists that they lived on nothing but air and fresh water. Leisure to taste the joys of earth, and to frolic. it joyously in honor of the jovial god of idleness. In Protestantism, was called Merry England. Says. Known authors of the romances make our mouths water with their pictures of those monumental feasts with which the men of that time regaled themselves between two battles and two devastations. Everything went by the barrel. Jordaens and the Flemish school have told the story of these feasts in their delightful pictures. Sublime gargantuan stomach. The sublime brains encircling all human thought. When puny and degenerate. If pedos, wine and Prussian schnapps, justly combined with compulsory labor, have weakened our bodies and narrowed our minds. And cramps his stomach and the machine enlarges its output are the very times when the economists preach to us the Malthusian theory, the of abstinence and the dogma of work. Rear to pluck out such tongues and throw them to the dogs. Big class, simple good faith, out itself to be thus indoctrinated. But with its native impetuosity it has blindly hurled itself into work and abstinence. Capitalist class has found itself condemned to laziness and forced enjoyment, deductiveness and overconsumption. But of the laborer bruises his flesh and tortures his nerves, is so fertile in griefs for the capitalist, which the productive class condemns itself obliges the capitalists to devote themselves to the overconsumption of the products turned out so riotously by the laborers. Capitalist production a century or two ago. The capitalist was a steady man of reasonable and peaceable habits. Himself with one wife or thereabouts. He was thirsty and ate only when he was hungry. He and ladies of the court the noble virtues of debauchery. To the newly rich makes it incumbent upon himself to cultivate the disease for which quicksilver is a specific in order to justify the labors imposed upon the workmen in quicksilver mines. Capitalist crams himself with capons stuffed with truffles and with the choicest brands of wine in order to encourage the breeders of blooded poultry and the growers of Bordelais. In the organism rapidly becomes shattered. The falls out. The shrink away from the teeth. Is deformed. The obtrudes abnormally. Ration becomes difficult. Thens become labored. Thens become stiff. There's knotted. Tool and body to endure the fatigues of debauchery. Bowed with the bump of philanthropic discrimination. Their brains over political economy. Political philosophy in elaborating thick soporific books to employ the leisure hours of compositors and pressmen. Them live a life of martyrdom. In on and showing off the fairy-like toilets which the seamstresses die in making. From morning until night from one gown into another. Further they give up their hollow heads to the artists in hair, who insist on assuaging their passion for the construction of false chignons. Bounce. Pin their boots. To make a coal miner blush. They round the whole night through at their charity balls in order to pick up a few cents for poor pay. Oh, sanctified souls! Double social function of non-producer and overconsumer. The capitalist was not only obliged to violate his modest taste, to his laborious habits of 2 centuries ago and to give himself up to unbounded luxury. See indigestibles and syphilitic debauches, but to withdraw from productive labor an enormous mass of men in order to enlist them as his assistants. figures to prove how colossal is this waste of productive forces. Census of 1861. Population of England and Wales comprised 20,066,244 persons. 9,776,259 male and 10,289,965 female. If too old of too young to work, the productive women, girls, ideological professions, governors, men, rates, prudes, artists, etc. People exclusively occupied with eating the labor of others under the form of land rent, etc. Gains a total of 8 million individuals of both sexes and of every age, including the capitalists who function in production, etc. Aliens. The figures run. Laborers, herdsmen, and farmers' daughters living at home. 8,261. In cotton, wool, milk. 42,607. 65,835. Furnaces, mills, etc. 96,998. 108,648. Are the textile workers and the miners. Weighing the figures of 2,208,442. If former we add the metal workers, we total of 1,039,605 persons. That's in case a number below that of the modern domestic slaves. Recent result of the capitalist exploitation of machines. Domestics, of which indicates the stage attained by capitalist civilization, will be added the enormous class of unfortunates devoted exclusively to satisfying the vain and expensive tastes of the rich dasses, debtors, liars, errors, of luxurious books, mistresses employed on expensive gowns, decorators of villas, etc. Into absolute laziness and demoralized by enforced enjoyment. The capitalist class, in spite of the injury involved in its new kind of life, adapted itself to it. Look upon any change with horror. The conditions of life resignedly accepted by the working class and the sight of the organic degradation engendered by the depraved passion for work increased its aversion for all compulsory labor and all restrictions of its pleasures. It at that time that, with taking into account the demoralization which the capitalist class had imposed upon itself as a social duty, the Proletarians took it into their heads to inflict work on the capitalists, artless as they were. Seriously the theories of work proclaimed by the economists and moralists, and up their loins to inflict the practice of these theories upon the capitalists. The boy hoisted the banner, "He not work neither shall he eat." 31 rose up for bulletin. The of March 1871 called their uprising the Revolution of Work. Tis of barbarous fury destructive of all capitalist joy and laziness. Capitalists had no other answer than ferocious repression, but that if they have been able to repress these revolutionary explosions, they drowned in the blood of these gigantic massacres the absurd idea of the proletariat wishing to inflict work upon the idle and reputable classes, To avert this misfortune that they surround themselves with guards, traits and in laborious unproductiveness. Room for illusion as to the function of modern arts, maintained only to suppress the enemy within. Paris and Lyons have not been built to defend the city against the foreigner, crush it in case of revolt. A terrible example be called for the Army of Belgium, paradise of capitalism. It is guaranteed by the European powers. Nevertheless, its army is one of the strongest in proportion to its population. The fields of the brave Belgian army are the plains of the Borinage and of Charleroi. The unarmed miners and laborers that the Belgian officers temper their swords and win their epaulets. They have not national armies but mercenary armies. The capitalists against the popular fury which would condemn them to 10 hours of mining or spinning. Pressing its own stomach, the working class has developed abnormally the stomach of the capitalist class to overconsumption. Of its painful labor, the capitalist class has withdrawn from the working class a mass of men far superior to those still devoted to useful production, and has condemned them in their turn to unproductiveness and overconsumption. Useless mouths, in spite of its insatiable voracity, suffice to consume all the goods which the laborers, bruised by the dogma of work, like madmen, wishing to consume them, and without even thinking whether people will be found to consume them. Double madness of the laborers killing themselves with overproduction and vegetating in abstinence. The problem of capitalist production is no longer to find producers and to multiply their powers, but to discover consumers, to their appetites, and create in them fictitious needs. Sin laborers, with cold and hunger, reach near the stuffs they weave, to the wines from the vineyards they tend. The manufacturers in their goodness of heart must run to the ends of the earth to find people to wear the clothes and drink the wines. Exports every year goods amounting to billions of dollars to the four corners of the earth, tons that have no need of them. But continents are no longer vast enough. Needed. Manufacturers dream night and day of Africa, of in the Saharan desert, of road to the Sudan. Follow the progress of Livingston, the marvelous tales of these brave travelers. What are contained in the dark continent? With elephant's teeth, of coconut oil are dotted with gold, of backsides, as the faces of Dufour and Girardin, are cotton goods to teach them decency, as of schnapps and Bibles from which they may learn the virtues of civilization. Purpose, fed capitalist, the class greater in numbers than the productive class, and barbarous nations, European goods, melt away the mountains of products heaped up higher and more enormous than the pyramids of Egypt. The European laborers defies all consumption. Others have lost their bearings and know not which way to turn. They find the raw material to satisfy the lawless depraved passion of their laborers for work. Dirty and half-rotten rags are raveled out to use in making certain cloths sold under the name of Renaissance, with about the same durability as the promises made to voters. In leaving the silk fiber in its natural simplicity and suppleness, it is down with mineral salts, while increasing its weight, malleable and far from durable. All are adulterated to aid in their sale and shorten their life. Are called the Age of Adulteration just as the first epochs of humanity received the names of the Age of Stone, Age of Bronze. Character of their production. People accuse our pious manufacturers of fraud. In reality, the thought which animates them is to furnish work to their laborers, not resign them with their arms folded. These, whose motive is a humanitarian sentiment, but splendid profits to the manufacturers who practice them, if disastrous for the quality of the goods, if an inexhaustible source of waste in human labor, thus prove the ingenuous philanthropy of the capitalists, and terrible perversion of the laborers, gratify their vice for work, oblige the manufacturers to stifle the cries of their conscience and to violate even the laws of the spite of the overproduction of goods, spite of the adulterations in manufacturing. Those encumber the market in countless numbers, imploring this ought to compel them to bridle their passion. On the contrary, it carries it to the point of paroxysm. Let work present itself. Rush. The man 12 hours to glut their appetite for work, and day they are again thrown out on the pavement with no more food for their vice. Industries' lockouts occur with the regularity of the seasons. Of the organism, aided by absolute rest during 2 or 4 months, and work ceases, the pittance ceases. Of work is diabolically attached to the heart of the laborers. Its requirements stifle all the other instincts of nature. The quantity of work required by society is necessarily limited by consumption and by the supply of raw materials. The work of a whole year, not distribute it uniformly over the 12 months and force every working man to content himself with 6 or 5 hours a day throughout the year instead of getting indigestion from 12 hours during 6 months. Daily portion of work. Others will no longer be jealous of each other, no longer fight to snatch away work from each other's hands and bread from each other's mouths. Exhausted in body and mind, begin to practice the virtues of laziness. Vice. Others have been unable to rise to the conception of this fact, that work for all it is necessary to apportion it like water on a ship in distress. Manufacturers in the name of capitalist exploitation have for a long time demanded a legal limitation of the work-day. Of 1860 on professional education, one of the greatest manufacturers of Alsace, and part of Guebwiller, the 12 hours is excessive and ought to be reduced to 11. Work ought to be stopped at 2 o'clock on Saturday. Option of this measure, all may appear onerous at first sight. We are industrial establishments for 4 years and find ourselves the better for it. The average production, from having diminished, increased. Machines. M.F. Passy quotes the following letter from a great Belgian manufacturer, Motivier. Machines, all the same as those of the English, to produce what they ought to produce or what those same machines would produce in England. All spinners there work 2 hours a day less. Good hours too much. If we worked only 11 hours instead of 13, we should have the same product and we should consequently produce more economically. Roy Bewley affirms that it is a remark of a great Belgian manufacturer that the weeks in which a holiday falls result in a product not less than ordinary weeks. A government has dared to do what a people do simplicity by the moralists dared. And moral industrial considerations of the economists, birds of ill omen. To reduce by 1 hour the work in factories was to decree the ruin of English industry. The of England has forbidden by a law strictly enforced to work more than 10 hours a day. And for England remains the first industrial nation of the world. The on so great a scale is on record. The variance of certain intelligent capitalists is on record. They doubt that to strengthen human production it is necessary to reduce the hours of labor and multiply the pay days and feast days. The French nation is not convinced. But reduction of 2 hours has increased English production by almost 1/3 in 10 years. Less speed would be given to French production by a legal limitation of the working day to 3 hours. Understand that by overworking themselves they exhaust their own strength and that of their progeny are used up and long before their time come to be incapable of any work at all. Absorbed and brutalized by this single vice they are no longer men but pieces of men. Feel within themselves all beautiful faculties. Nothing alive and flourishing except the furious madness for work. Larets. Eat the lesson of the lurk. Let to increase the national wealth. Is it cause you work too much that the industrial equipment develops slowly? Listen to an economist. Then M.L. Rabaud. Were fortunate enough to lose a few months ago. By the conditions of handwork that the revolution in methods of labor is regulated. As work furnishes its services at a low price, efforts are made to economize it when its services become more costly. Capitalists to improve their machines of wood and iron it is necessary to raise wages and diminish the working hours of the machines of flesh and blood. Two proofs. They by the hundreds. The acting mule was invented and applied at Manchester because the spinners refused to work such long hours as before. Machine is invading all branches of farm production, making of butter to the wheating of wheat. The American, lazy, were 1,000 deaths to the bovine life of the French peasant. Painful and so crippling to the laborer in our glorious France. The American West an agreeable open-air pastime. Practices in a sitting posture. His pipe nonchalantly. Music. By diminishing the hours of labor new mechanical forces will be conquered for social production. By urging the laborers to consume their products the army of workers will be immensely increased. The class once relieved from its function of universal consumer will hasten to dismiss its train of soldiers, magistrates, has withdrawn from useful labor to help it in consuming and wasting. That will overflow. Then an iron law to put a limit on work. It will to find employment for that swarm of former unproductives, numerous than insect parasites, and them must be considered all those who provide for their needs and their vain and expensive tastes. More lackeys and generals to decorate, free and married prostitutes to be covered with laces, cannons to bore, nor palaces to build. The need of severe laws to compel the working women N.W. or been employed on embroidered laces, ikings, to hygienic and calisthenic exercises requisite to re-establish their health and improve their race, and to consume European products at home instead of sending them to the devil. Necessary that the sailors, dandlers and the draymen sit down and learn to twirl their thumbs. The Asians may then love as they like without fearing the civilized Venus and the sermons of European moralists. And to find work for all the non-producers of our present society, and to leave room for the industrial equipment to go on developing indefinitely, the class will be compelled, like capitalist class, to silence to its taste for abstinence and to develop indefinitely its consuming capacities. An ounce or two of gristly meat once a day, with any juicy beef steaks of a pound or two, of drinking moderately of bad wine, it become more orthodox than the Pope and will drink broad and deep bumpers of Bordeaux and Burgundy without commercial baptism and will leave water to the beasts. Those have taken into their heads to inflict upon the capitalists 10 hours of forge and factory, that great mistake, but of social antagonisms and civil wars, forbidden and not imposed. And other capitalists should be allowed to bring testimony to the fact that throughout their whole lives they have been perfect vagabonds. They swear they wish to continue to live as perfect vagabonds in spite of the general mania for work. Be pensioned and should receive every morning at the City Hall a $5 gold piece for their pocket money. Words will vanish. Capitalists will be first to rally to the popular party, convinced that far from wishing them harm, it is rather to relieve them of the labor of overconsumption and waste. They have been overwhelmed since their birth. Who are incapable of proving their title to the name of vagabond, allowed to follow. Stinks. Disgusting occupations in which to place them. Set at cleaning public closets. Might perform surgical operations on diseased horses and hogs. The Misty Commission might be sent to the stockyards to pick out the oxen and the sheep to be slaughtered. Play the part of undertakers and lackeys in funeral processions. Nations could be found for them on a level with their intelligence. Logli could cork champagne bottles. They would have to be muzzled as a precaution against intoxication. Net and Tirade might destroy the bugs and vermin in the departments of state and other public houses. It was necessary to put the public funds out of the reach of the capitalists out of due regard for their acquired habits. And prolonged upon the moralists who have perverted nature. There's hypocrites and other such sects of men who disguise themselves like maskers to deceive the world. The common people to understand that they are busied about nothing but contemplation and devotion in fastings and maceration of their sensuality, only to sustain and aliment the small frailty of their humanity, if far otherwise that on the contrary, goes where they make, e curis simulant, bacchanalia vivunt. Great letters, in the ring of their red snouts, etching bellies as big as a ton, and b when they perfume themselves with sulphur plus on the days of great popular rejoicing, wet of swallowing dust as on the 15th of August and 14th of July under capitalism. The unionists and collectivists will eat, dance to their heart's content, those of the Academy, and Polet. The those with long robes and short, economic, click, print, Pavist and Free Thought Church, propagandists of Malthusianism, Christian, atheistic, or dependent ethics, in yellow, compelled to hold a candle until it bums their fingers, starve in sight of tables loaded with meats and flowers, and shall agonize with thirst in sight of flowing hogsheads. For with the changing seasons they shall be shut up like the knife grinder's dogs in great wheels, and condemned to grind wind for 10 hours. The slaters shall suffer the same punishment. Idleness, to time, kills us second by second. The shows and theatrical performances always and always. A very work for our bourgeois legislators. With them into traveling companies to go to the fairs and villages, legislative exhibitions. The riding boots, fists brilliantly decorated with medals and crosses, show through the streets and courts, levying recruits among the good people. Comrade Casagnac shall tend door. In dual list costume, his eyes and twisting his mustache, out burning toe, threaten everyone with his father's pistol and sink into a hole as soon as they show him Lullier's portrait. Course on foreign politics and on Little Greece, who doctor of him and would set Europe on fire to pilfer Turkey, Russia that stultifies him with the mincemeat, to make of Prussia, and who would fain see mischief brewing in the west of Europe so as to feather her nest in the east and to strangle nihilism at home. Dr. Bismarck, who was good enough to allow him to pronounce himself on the amnesty, covering his mountainous belly smeared over with red and white and blue, the national colors, beat the tattoo on it, and rate the delicate little ortolans, and the glasses of Margot and Wyquem that it has. Encourage agriculture, and keep his electors of Belleville in good spirits. Entertainment will open with the plus electoral farce plus. In voters with wooden heads and asses' ears. Trois candidates. Clowns. Dance the dance of political liberties. Themselves fore and aft with their freely promising electoral programs, ending with tears in their eyes of the miseries of the people and with copper in their voices of the glories of France. Voters will bray solidly in chorus. Han. Ha. The great play, that of the nation's goods. Miss female. Haste and bald-headed, pun pale, with eyes, and yawning, stretching herself out on a velvet couch. Atrial capitalism, antic organism of iron, whip-like mask, mechanically devouring men and children. Thrilling and heart-rending cries fill the air, with a marten's muzzle on his body and harpy hands, he flipping coins out of his pocket. Imitated proletarians in rags, it by gendarmes with drawn sabers, furies lashing them with whips of hunger, bringing to the feet of capitalist France heaps of merchandise, casks of wine, casks of gold and wheat. Garment in one hand, the mint of Proudhon in the other, and the book of the national budget between his teeth, imped at the head of the defenders of national property and is mounting guard. When gun stocks and pricked with bayonets, burdens, they're driven away and the door is opened to the manufacturers and bankers. They pell-mell upon the heap, cotton goods, of wheat, gold, and casks of wine. All they can, down disgusting objects in their ordure and vomitings. Thenceforth, the shakes and opens, Oric destiny arises, wherein foot she crushes the heads of the capitalists. Spring, to flee. She overthrows capitalist France, and sweating with fear. From its heart the vice which dominates it and degrades its nature. Class were to arise in its terrible strength. Demand the rights of man, with the rights of capitalist exploitation. Demand the right to work which is but the right to misery. But urge a brazen law forbidding any man to work more than 3 hours a day. The earth, with joy, would feel a new universe leaping within her. Ask a proletariat corrupted by capitalist ethics to manly resolution. The whole personification of ancient slavery, and the children of the proletariat have been climbing painfully for a century up the hard Calvary of pain. Century compulsory toil has broken their bones, their flesh, their nerves. Century hunger has torn their entrails and their brains. On our long misery. Of the arts and noble virtues, balm of human anguish. A very modest people. A dogma of work. They'll have doubts of its efficacy in tranquilizing the soul, the spirit, and the proper functioning of the entrails and other organs. Its workings on the populace, civilly, buffeting it against the capitalists, to use and authorize whose vices is their peculiar mission. But you, sent philosophers, cudgel your brains to work out an ethics the practice of which you dare not counsel to your masters. You are so proud, wish to see it scoffed at. History of ancient peoples and the writings of their philosophers and lawgivers. Father of history. Greeks derived from the Egyptians the contempt which they have for work. I find the same contempt established among the Thracians, the Huns, the among most barbarians. They learn mechanical arts and even their children are regarded as the meanest of their citizens. All nurtured in this principle. Early the Lacedaemonians. Peasants were veritable nobles who had to concern themselves but with the defense and the administration of the community. Savage warriors from whom they descended have all their time free to watch over the interests of the Republic. Mental and bodily strength, all labor upon the slaves. Daemon. Women were not allowed to spin or weave that they might not detract from their nobility. Recognized but two noble and free professions, archer and arms. All by right lived at the expense of the treasury without being constrained to provide for their living by any of the sordid arts. They hated the trades, rightfully belonged to slaves. To arouse the people, a darkened, special outrage of having converted free citizens into artisans and masons. Philosophers had their disputes upon the origin of ideas, but they agreed when it came to the abhorrence of work. Plato in his social utopia, his republic, has made no shoemaker nor smith. Sins degrade the people who exercise them. Vice. Wretches. By their very condition excluded from political rights. Accustomed to lying and deceiving, they allowed in the city only as a necessary evil. Thou have degraded himself by the commerce of the shop shall be prosecuted for this offence. It shall be condemned to a year in prison. Punishment shall be doubled for each repeated offence. Inks. Rights. The who give themselves up to manual labor are never promoted to public offices. And reason. Them. To be seated the whole day long. Sin to endure the heat of the fire continually. Kale to be changed in body. Almost inevitable that the mind be affected. What can come out of a shop, asks Cicero. Reduce in the way of honor. A shop is unworthy an honorable man. No profit without lying. Is more shameful than falsehood. Regard as something base and vile the trade of those who sell their toil and industry. Whoever gives his labor for money sells himself and puts himself in the tank of slaves. Bruised by the dogma of work. The voice of these philosophers, been concealed from you with jealous care. A son who gives his labor for money degrades himself to the rank of slaves. He's a crime which deserves years of imprisonment. Democracy and capitalist utilitarianism had not perverted these philosophers of the ancient republics. Men pressed their thought naively. Aristotle, the intellectual giants, but our latter-day philosophers are but pygmies, citizens of their ideal republics to live in the most complete leisure. Xenophon observed, works all the time and with it one has no leisure for the republic and his friends. A dark the claim of Lycurgus, of men, to admiration of posterity. We had granted leisure to the citizens of Sparta by forbidding to them any trade whatever. Of Christianity and capitalism will answer. Thinkers and philosophers praised the institution of slavery, but have been otherwise. The economic and political conditions of their epoch. State of ancient societies. Obliged to devote his time to discussing th. 8 and watching over its defense. The too primitive and clumsy for those practicing them to exercise their birthright of soldier and citizen. The philosophers and lawgivers wish to have warriors and citizens in their heroic republics, obliged to tolerate slaves. Moralists and economists of capitalism praise wage labor, modern slavery. What men does the capitalist slavery give leisure? Child, embuscade, and harmful slaves of their vices and of their domestic servants. The slavery dominated the minds of Pythagoras and Aristotle, been written disdainfully. Aristotle foresaw that every tool could by itself execute its proper function. Masterpieces of Daedalus moved themselves, or as the tripods of Vulcan set themselves spontaneously at their sacred work. Example, the shuttles of the weavers did their own weaving. Of the W. Or no more need of helpers. Master of slaves. Aim is our reality. Our with of fire, with of unwearying steel. Fruitfulness, full inexhaustible, accomplish by themselves with docility their sacred labor. and genius of the great philosophers of capitalism remains dominated by the prejudice of the wage system, slaveries. They understand that the machine is the savior of humanity, the who shall redeem man from the sordid arts and from working for hire, the who shall give him leisure and liberty.